spoken on many occasions about the risks associated with the decline of world institutions, the erosion of collective security principles, and the substitution of international law for the so-called rules. I wanted to say, you know who came up with those, but no one knows who came up with these rules, what underlies these rules, what's inside those rules. I think there is an attempt to introduce just one rule. For the powers that be, the global powers that be, should have a chance to do whatever they please and be, able to do whatever without any punishment, with impunity. The value of the Valdai discussions consists in the fact that different assessments and forecasts are expressed here, and as to their accuracy, life itself has confirmed them with certainty, because the most rigorous and unbiased examiner is life. It shows how accurate our discussions in the previous years have been. Alas, the developments are following the negative scenario so far, and we spoke about this negative scenario on multiple occasions during previous meetings. Moreover, these developments have turned into a large-scale systemic crisis, not just militarily political, but also economic and humanitarian. The so-called West, as it were, because there is no unity. We understand that this is a very complex conglomerate, but be that as it may, let's call it the West. Over the recent years, and especially over the last months, has taken several steps towards escalation. And they're always trying to escalate. There's nothing new in that. They're fueling the war in Ukraine, organizing provocations around Taiwan, destabilizing the world food and energy markets. As far as the last one is concerned, it was not deliberate. We do not doubt that. It was due to a number of systemic errors committed by the Western authorities I've just mentioned. And as we can see, it's all been compounded by the destruction of European gas pipelines. This is incredible, but this is, however, something we're witnessing, these tragic events. Dominion of the world is precisely what the so-called West has decided to stake in this game. But this game is a dangerous, dirty, and deadly one. It contests the sovereignty of peoples and nations, their identity and uniqueness, and has no regard whatsoever for the interests of other countries. Well, we cannot say rejection directly, but this is basically what we see happening in life. And those who formulate these rules believe that others have no right to their unique path. Everyone needs to abide by these rules. And I would like to remind you of Russia's proposal addressed to our Western partners. The proposal to reinforce trust and build a system of collective security last December. Yet again, this proposal was cast aside. But in the modern world, it's not going to be possible to sit this one out. Whoever sows the wind will reap the whirlwind. The crisis has taken on a truly global magnitude. It affects everyone, and we should not entertain any illusions as to that. Humanity is essentially faced with two options. Either we continue accumulating the burden of problems that is certain to crush all of us, or we can work together to find solutions, functional if imperfect ones, solutions capable of rendering our world more stable and safer. You know, I've always believed in the power of common sense, and I still do. And that is why I'm convinced that sooner or later, both the new centers of a multipolar world and the West will have to embark upon an equal dialogue about our shared future. And the sooner that happens, the better, naturally. And in that regard, I would like to share with you some emphases which we find very important. The developments of today have relegated to the background environmental issues. As surprising as that may be, this is something I'd like to start with. And climate change is no longer in the headlines, but far from disappearing, these fundamental challenges are only growing worse. One of the most dangerous consequences of the environmental imbalance is a reduction in natural biological diversity. And right now I'd like to move to the topic we've all gathered for. Is other kind of diversity any less important? I refer to cultural, social, political, and civilizational diversity. At the same time, simplification, erasure of all differences, well, this is all but the essence of the modern world. But what is behind this simplification? First and foremost, it's the depletion of the West's creative potential and its desire to contain and to inhibit free development of other civilizations. There's also a direct self-serving interest hiding there. By imposing their values, consumer models, they seek to standardize these models. Our opponents, let me put it mildly, are trying to expand their markets for their products. So, it's all very simple. And it's no coincidence that the West says that it's its culture and its world view that should be recognized as universal. They are not saying that outright, but this is how they behave. And they insist through their policies on everyone accepting these values unconditionally. Let me quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn's famous Harvard address. Back in 1978, he said that the West, let me quote, has a blindness of superiority that continues, and this is what happens, and upholds the belief that the vast regions everywhere on our planet should develop and mature to the level of present-day Western systems. It was back in 1978. Nothing has changed since then. Over the last 50 years or so, this blindness Solzhenitsyn spoke of, by its nature, it's racist and neo-colonial, and it has taken on an unsightly form once the so-called unipolar world was established. But what can I say in response? Belief in one's own infallibility is a dangerous state because it's but one step away from a desire by those who deem themselves infallible to destroy, obliterate those they do not like, as they say, to cancel them. Let's think about the sense of this world, the meaning of it, even at the height of the Cold War, when the confrontation of systems, ideologies, and military machines where opposition was in full swing. It never occurred to anyone to reject, deny the very existence of culture, art, and science of your opponent. Yes, there were several restrictions with regard to educational, scientific, cultural, and regrettably sports relations. But be that as it may, both Soviet and American leaders of those days had an understanding that humanitarian field is very delicate. You've got to study your opponent and have respect for him, and sometimes even learn from him, to preserve a foundation for healthy, constructive relations for the future. But what is happening now? Back in their days, Nazis went as far as to burn books. Right now, the Western champions of liberalism and progress have slipped into banning Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky. The so-called cancel culture is basically a cancellation of culture that annihilates everything that is alive and creative. It stunts the growth of free thought in economy, politics, and culture. The very liberal ideology itself has today changed beyond recognition. In the very beginning, classical liberalism interpreted the freedom of each and every person as the freedom to say what you want, do what you want. But in the 20th century, liberals started to proclaim that the so-called open society has enemies. Well, it turns out open society has enemies. And the freedom of these enemies could and should be restricted, if not abolished altogether. And right now, they've reached an absurd situation when any alternative point of view is declared to be a subversive propaganda and a threat to democracy. Whatever comes from Russia, well, it's all the Kremlin's doing, but they should look at themselves first. Are we all powerful? If we see any criticism with regard to our opponents. Why is it seen as the Kremlin's doing? They should, think harder. They have to present more conceptually their point of view. They cannot simply shift the blame on the Kremlin's intrigues. And all of these was prophetically described back in the 19th century by Fyodor Dostoevsky. One of the characters of his novel, The Possessed, Shigolov, a nihilist, describes the bright future he devised. I quote, "Starting from unlimited freedom, I arrive at unlimited despotism." And our Western partners have arrived precisely at this point. And it's echoed by another character of the novel, Pyotr Verkovensky, who says that what we need is universal betrayal, spying, and snitching. He says that society does not need talents nor superior capabilities. He says Cicero will have his tongue cut out, Copernicus will have his eyes put out, Shakespeare will be stoned. And this is what our Western opponents have come to. What is it if not the current Western cancel culture? Because it was a great thinker, and I'm truly thankful to my assistants who've found these will have his eyes put out, Shakespeare will be stoned. And this is what our Western will have his eyes put out, Shakespeare will be stoned. And this is what our Western opponents have come to. What is it if not the current Western cancel culture? Because it was a great thinker, and I'm truly thankful to my assistants who've found these, and I'm truly thankful to my Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky and Pushkin, whatever anyone says. Standardization, financial, technological monopoly, erasure of all and every difference. This has been the foundation of the Western globalizational model, whose nature is neo-colonial, basically. And the task was clear: to reinforce absolute dominion of the West and the world economy and the world politics, to put to service natural, financial, intellectual, human, and economic capabilities of the whole planet, doing that under the guise of the so-called new global interdependence. Let me recall yet another Russian philosopher here, Alexander Zinoviev. We are going to celebrate his centenary in a couple of days, on October the 29th. More than 20 years ago, he said that for the Western civilization to survive at the level it had attained, it would need, I quote, all of the planet as its habitat. It would need all the resources of humanity, and this is what they laid their claim to. It's so true. And in this system, the West enjoys an inherent incredible advantage because it came up with the principles and mechanisms of this system. The principles, everyone is talking about what are these principles. A black hole, no one understands. But once globalization started to benefit not Western countries but other countries, I refer first and foremost to big nations of Asia, the West either revisited many of the rules or even abolished some of them. And as far as the sacrosanct principles of free trade, economic openness and equal competition, even property are concerned, well, all of these principles were all of a sudden altogether forgotten. When it was no longer beneficial, they decided to revisit the rules on the go. Yet another strawman argument and doublespeak. Western ideologues and politicians have long been telling the world there is no alternative to democracy. But in truth, what they meant was the Western, the so-called liberal democratic model, whereas all other variants and forms of democracy were rejected by them with disdain and arrogance. It's been characteristic of them since the colonial times, because they think that everyone, is just substandard, whereas only they belong to the elite. But right now, the absolute majority of the world community demands democracy in world affairs. They reject authoritarian diktat of certain countries or groups of countries. What is it if not direct application of democratic principles in interstate affairs? But what is the position of the so-called civilized West? If you are Democrats, then one would think you would welcome this natural desire, aspiration towards freedom of billions of people. But it's not the case. The West calls that the sabotage of liberal world order based on rules, and it resorts to economic and trade wars, sanctions, boycotts, color revolutions, and it hatches and conducts different kinds of coup d'etat. And, they even say how much money they spend on the coup d'etat, the cheek of it. Well, what about Soleimani, who was taken out? You can think whatever you want about him, but it's an official, a dignitary. He was killed in the third country. So what is it? Washington, as its tradition, calls the current world order a liberal world order, but day in, day out, this world order begets more and more chaos. And it is becoming increasingly intolerant, even with regard to Western countries, should they attempt any kind of autonomy. And they even slap sanctions on their own allies, unabashedly. And others are simply, showing obeisance. Let's remember the July proposals of Hungarian parliamentarians who suggested that dedication to European Christian values and culture should be enshrined in a treaty on the European Union. But these attempts were seen not just as opposition, but hostile sabotage. Someone likes them, some others. But we in Russia, over thousands of years, have seen a peaceful coexistence of different religions, but we do not require that they should be changed, neither Christian values, nor Muslim values, nor other religious values. We have to treat one another with respect. In a number of regions, and I know that firsthand, people go together to celebrate Christian and Buddhist and Muslim and Jewish holidays. Well, I think it's worth speaking about at least. This testifies to the ideological crisis of the neoliberal model of the world order. In the American fashion, they have no creative or positive agenda. They have nothing to offer to the world apart from retaining their domination. A true democracy in a multipolar world requires an opportunity for every nation, every society, every civilization to choose their own path, their own social and political system. And if the US and the EU enjoy this rule, then Asian countries, Muslim countries, the Gulf monarchies, and countries of other continents should have this right, and Russia too. And no one will ever be able to dictate to our nation what kinds of society and on what principles we should be building. A direct threat to the political, economic, and ideological monopoly of the West consists in the fact that the world can see the emergence of alternative social models, which can turn out to be more efficient, more vibrant, more attractive than the ones that exist as of now. And these models will emerge and develop. This is inevitable. Incidentally, American political scientists, experts, are writing on the subject directly, but the powers that be do not listen to them. But they can't help seeing that these ideas are being expressed and voiced on the pages of political science journals and in discussions. This development should be based upon a dialogue of civilizations, with an emphasis on spiritual and moral values. Yes, different civilizations have a different understanding of a human being and his nature, but it's only at the surface, because all of them recognize the highmost value and spiritual nature of a human being. And the foundation is of paramount importance. The foundation upon which our shared future is going to be built, I would like to point out the following. Traditional values are not a fixed set of principles everyone must abide by. Far be it from it. The difference from the so-called liberal values consists in the fact that all of them are unique because they stem from a tradition of concrete society, its culture and historical experience. This is why traditional values cannot be imposed on anyone. You need to simply have respect for them. Treat with care what has been devised over centuries by each and every people, each and every nation. This is our understanding of traditional values, and this approach is shared and accepted by the majority of humanity. It's only natural because traditional societies of the East, Latin America, Africa, and Eurasia form the backbone of world civilization. Respect for the unique characteristics of nations and civilizations, this is in the interest of each and everyone because it even suits the interests of the West because it loses its superiority, turning into a minority in the world arena. And of course, the right of this Western minority to its own unique culture, unique identity, should be guaranteed. Unconditionally, we have to treat that with respect, but the same should apply to the rights of everyone else. If the Western elites believe that they can, introduce into the society and the consciousness of the society such bizarre, trendy notions as dozens of genders or pride parades, well, let them do that. Let them do whatever they want. But they do not have the right to demand that others should follow in their footsteps. As we can see, Western countries are undergoing complex demographic, political, and social processes. It's their domestic affairs. Russia does not interfere within these affairs, nor is it going to. Unlike the West, we're not getting into someone else's backyard. But we hope that pragmatism will emerge victorious, and the dialogue between Russia and the genuine traditional West, as well as other equal centers of development, all of that is going to be an important contribution to the construction of a multipolar world order. I would like to remind you that the multipolar world is the only chance for Europe to rebuild its political and economic autonomy. Well, I'm not going to hide it. We understand, and even Europe says it. Right now, this autonomy of Europe, let me put it mildly, not to offend anyone, this autonomy is very restricted.
The world is diverse in its nature, and the attempts of the West to make everyone fit the mold are objectively doomed. Nothing will come of it. The overconfident strive to global leadership, and in essence to dictate, or maintaining the leadership through dictate, is in reality leading to the lower international standing of the U.S., including the U.S. It leads to growing mistrust to their capability to deal with anyone in general. One thing today, another thing tomorrow. You sign the document and then you tear it apart. There is no stability whatsoever in anything. How we can talk to them, sign documents? Can we rely on them? It's unclear. Before, only some countries allowed themselves to argue with America, and that looked like almost scandalous. And now it's a routine thing when very different countries refuse Washington in its baseless demands, despite the fact that it still is trying to apply pressure to everyone. I think this is a very wrong policy. It's a road to nowhere. But let it be. It's their choice. I'm convinced that the people of the world would not disregard the policy of intimidation that has discredited itself. And every time for the attempts to maintain its hegemony, the West will have to pay, and to pay a higher price each time. If I were a Western elite, I would seriously think about this future. Just like today, some political scientists and politicians are contemplating in the U.S. itself. In the current situation of harsh conflict, I'd like to say a matter of principle that Russia, being an independent and unique civilization, has never considered itself an enemy of the West. Americanophobia, Anglophobia, Francophobia, Germanophobia. Just the same kind of racism as Russophobia and anti-Semitism, just like any other manifestation of xenophobia. We simply need to clearly understand, as I have said before, there are at least two types of West, maybe more. There is the West of traditional, primarily Christian values, freedom, patriotism, and rich culture, and now of Islamic values as well. A significant amount of population professes Islam, and this kind of West is close to us. We have common roots based in classical antiquity. But there is another kind of West, aggressive, cosmopolite, neo-colonial, being a weapon of neoliberal elites. And Russia, naturally, will never make peace with the dictate of this kind of West. In 2000, after I was elected the president, I remember fully well, and I'll always remember this, I remember what price we've paid for annihilating the terrorist den in the Northern Caucasus when the West has practically openly supported here, grown-up people here, and you know what I'm talking about here. We all know that was the fact of life. It was financial, political, and information support that was rendered. We've all lived through that. Moreover, the West did not only actively supported terrorists on the territory of Russia, but it has largely nurtured this threat. We knew that. Nevertheless, after the situation has stabilized, when main terrorist groups were decisively defeated, thanks to the courage of the Chechen people as well, we've made the decision not to look back, not to hold grudges, but rather to move forward and to build relations, including with those who basically worked against us. We decided to build relations with everyone who wanted to do that, based on mutual benefit and respect to each other. We thought it was in our common interests. Thank God, Russia has survived through all the hardships of that time. We persevered, we coped with domestic/external terrorism. We maintained our economy, and it continued to grow. Our military capacity increased. We're trying to build relations with the leading countries of the West, with NATO as well. We had one message. Let's stop being an enemy to each other. Let's live in harmony. Let's build a dialogue, build trust, and therefore peace. In that, we were absolutely sincere. I'd like to highlight that. We understood clearly how complex such rapprochement would be. We still did it. But what did we get in return? In a nutshell, it was basically a no on all main dimensions of possible cooperation. What we got in return is permanent pressure on us and creating hotbeds of tension at our borders. And if I may ask, what was the goal of that pressure? What was the goal? Just to practice? Well, of course not. The goal was to make Russia more vulnerable and to turn Russia into a tool of achieving their own geopolitical goals. That's it. That's the rule of the thumb. Everyone is turned into a tool, and to use these tools to their own ends. And those who do not obey to this pressure, who doesn't want to be a tool, sanctions are introduced against them. Economic restrictions are introduced against them. Coup d'etats are being prepared and executed where possible, and so on. And in the end, if they do not succeed in anything, then the main goal is to eliminate, to wipe off the map. But that didn't work with Russia, and it will never happen. It will never be possible to implement this scenario. Russia does not challenge the elites of the West. Russia is simply standing up to its right to exist and to freely develop. We ourselves do not intend to become a new hegemon. Russia does not offer to substitute unipolar world with bipolar or tripolar world, the domination of the West with domination of the East or North or South, that would lead to yet another dead end. And I would like to quote the words of a great Russian philosopher, Nikolai Danilevsky, who believed, and I quote, that the progress is not everyone marching in the same direction as our opponents are trying to make us, but rather, well, the progress would soon cease in that case, says Danilevsky. But the idea of the progress is to walk and explore the whole field of historically human domain in all directions. And he adds, not a single one civilization can be proud of presenting the apex of development. End of quote. I'm convinced that dictatorship can only be countered through the freedom of development of countries and nations, identity loss countered through the love to human being as a creator. The primitive simplification and bans can be countered through the flourishing complexity of cultures and tradition. The main idea of today's point in time is that all civilizations, states, and their integration associations indeed have opened all paths to pave their own democratic and original path. Primarily, we believe that the new world order should be based on law and justice. It should be free, fair, and unique. The world economy and trade should become more fair and open. Russia believes that it is unavoidable that the new international financial platforms will take shape, also for international payments. Such platforms should be outside of any national jurisdiction. They should be safe, depoliticized, automatic, and they should not depend on one single governance center. Is it possible? Yes. It would require a lot of effort and joining efforts of many countries, but it is possible. And that would rule out the possible abuse in new global financial infrastructure that would allow to effectively, beneficially, and safely and securely do without dollar and other so-called reserve currencies in international payments. The most so since the West has discredited the Institute of International Reserves using dollar as a weapon. First, they were depreciated through inflation in dollar and eurozone, and later they have effectively pocketed our assets snippety-snap. Transition to payments in national currencies will gain momentum, unavoidably. Naturally, that will depend on the state of the economies of the emitting countries and so on. But still, these payments will become predominant. That is the logic of sovereign economy and financial policy in the multipolar world. Moving on. Today, new centers for global development already possess unique technology and scientific developments in very diverse spheres. And in many dimensions, they can successfully compete with the Western transnational companies. It is apparent that we have common and rather pragmatic interest in an honest and open scientific and technological exchange. Together, everyone will benefit more than separately. The majority should benefit, but not the separate ultra-rich corporations. What's happening today? If the West is selling medicine or seeding material to other countries, then they give the order to kill off national pharmaceutical and selection industry. In reality, everything boils down to that. When the West procures machine tools and equipment, that wrecks local machine building. When I was the chairman of the government, I remember it was very simple. As soon as you open your market for a certain item, goods, then the local producer is going down, and it's almost impossible to bring back the industry. That's the way they build the relations. That's how they take over markets and resources. The countries are left without their technological and scientific potential. That is not progress, that is enslavement, bringing down the economy to a primitive level. Technological development should not exacerbate global inequality, but rather decrease it. That is the tradition for Russian foreign policy and technology. For example, when we are building nuclear power plants in other countries, we simultaneously are creating their centers of excellence and nurture local talent. We create the whole industry. We don't just build one plant, we build the whole industry. And in essence, we give other countries an opportunity to make a real breakthrough in their scientific and technological development, to bridge the inequality gap, and to bring their energy to the new level of efficiency and environmental friendliness. I'd like to highlight once again, sovereignty and independent development does not mean isolation or autarky, but that, on the contrary, means active cooperation, mutually beneficial cooperation based on justice and equal rights. If the liberal globalization brings about depersonalization and imposing the Western model on everyone around the world, then integration, on the contrary, is tapping into potential of each civilization in the interests of the whole for common good. If globalism means dictate, that what it boils down to, then integration is finding common strategies beneficial to everyone. In this regard, Russia believes necessary to more actively launch mechanisms of creating larger spaces built on cooperation between neighboring countries whose economy, social system, resources, and infrastructure complement each other. Such large spaces, in essence, are the foundation for the multipolar world order, the economic foundation. The dialogue of such spaces gives birth to true unity of humankind, much more complex, unique, and multidimensional than in simplified versions of Western ideologists. Well, some of them at least. The unity of humanity cannot be built according to the order, be like us, do like us. It's taken shape with consideration to the opinion of everyone, with careful treatment of identity of each community and nation. Only this principle can be the foundation for long-term cooperation in multipolar world. In this regard, maybe we should think about the structure of the United Nations, including its Security Council, how it should better reflect the multitude of global regions, because it is Asia, of Africa, Latin America of tomorrow will be defining much more than it is commonly thought today, and that is a positive thing. I'd like to remind you that the Western civilization is not the only one in our common Eurasian space. Moreover, the majority of the population is situated in the east of Eurasia, which was the cradle of the ancient civilization of humanity. The value and significance of Eurasia is that this continent is a self-reliant complex which has tremendous resources of all kinds and wonderful opportunities. The harder we work on greater interconnectedness in Eurasia, on creating new paths and forms of cooperation, the more tangible result we'll achieve. Successful activity of Eurasian economic unity, rapid growth of clout and influence of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, large-scale initiatives in One Belt, One Road initiative, plans for multilateral cooperation on implementation of the transportation corridor north-south, and many other projects in that part of the world, I'm sure, bringing in the dawn of the new era, of the new stage in Eurasian development. Integration projects here do not compete, but rather complement each other. Naturally, if they're implemented by the neighboring countries in their own interests and not introduced by external forces in order to drive a wedge in Eurasian space and to turn into a zone of bloc standoff. A natural part of the greater Eurasia could be its western tip of the continent, I mean Europe, but many of its leaders are blinded by the convincement, by their idea that Europeans are better than others, that it's beneath them to cooperate in some endeavors as equals with others. With this arrogance, they somehow did not notice that they've turned to be into periphery to others, quite often into vassals without the right of vote. Colleagues, the collapse of the Soviet Union has destroyed the equilibrium of the geopolitical forces. The West has felt that it's the winner and has proclaimed the unipolar world order, where only its will, its culture, and its interest had the right to exist. Now this historical period of undivided domination of the West is coming to an end. It's becoming the thing of the past. I mean, the unipolar world. We're facing a historic milestone. Ahead of us is possibly the most dangerous, unpredictable, and at the same time crucial decade since the end of the Second World War. The West is incapable of unilaterally governing the humanity. However, it desperately tries to do that. The majority of the nation does not want to make peace with that. That is the main contradiction of the new era. The situation is rather revolutionary if we apply to the classics. Well, if we speak in the words of the classics, the elites do not want the change, but the poor cannot live any longer with that. How to solve the issues of tomorrow is the main task for humanity. That is a painful and natural, though unavoidable process. The future world order is being shaped before our eyes. And in this case, we need to listen to everyone, to hear out every point of view, every nation, every society, culture, and religious ideas without imposing a single truth upon anyone. And only on the basis of that, understanding our responsibility for the destiny of the planet, we should build the symphony of human civilization. I think I would like to wrap up with that, and I would like to thank you for the patience that you have shown me listening to my statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for this all-encompassing address. I can't help but, take up from where you left. You remember the revolutionary situation, the elites, the people. Whom do you associate yourself? Well, with the people, of course, because I am, below from the people. I said that on multiple occasions. My mother, my family, my parents, they were workers. They, they didn't even have vocational training. She used to work as a nurse, a nanny, and my father used to work as a night warden. He didn't want to leave me at the kindergarten. And this has always been the case with me. I listen to the pulse of popular life, how rank and file citizens live. So internationally, you are on the side of those who do no longer want. Well, I advocate what I've just said. I advocate democratic relations with due regard for the interests of all participants of international cooperation, not just the interests of the so-called golden billion. Yes, I understand that. We met 1 year ago. Back then, there was some tension in the international affairs, but when we look at October last year, it seems an idyll. A lot has changed over the last year. The world has been turned upside down, as some put it. To you personally, what has changed over the year that has passed internally in your perception of the world and of the country? What's been happening, what is still happening? In Ukraine in particular, well, these are not changes that are currently underway or are underway since the beginning of the special military operation. No, these changes have been happening for many years now. Some have been paying attention, others have not, but these are tectonic shifts of the whole global order. These tectonic plates are constantly shifting and moving, and as experts say, first, it's all very calm, very tranquil. These plates are on the move constantly. Then they come against one another. The tensions build up and an earthquake happens. So this is how it happened here. First, an accumulation of tensions and then a flare-up. But these changes used to happen in the past because new centers of power are emerging, and I'm not the only one to say that. These changes are happening due to objective reasons. Some power centers are wilting, and I'm not going to say why that is happening. This is only a natural process of bloom and perish and change. New ones are emerging mostly in Asia, but also in Africa. Yes, Africa is still a very poor continent so far. But you see the great potential to tap into. And the same applies to Latin America, and these changes will happen, these tectonic shifts. And it's the West that has driven us to this point. If there are any more questions, I'm ready to get back to what has happened in Ukraine. We were not the ones to organize a coup d'etat in Ukraine, which resulted in a series of tragic events, including our special military operation. We are not the ones who did it, but that does not matter. What matters is that tectonic shifts are always happening, and they will continue to happen independent of our actions. Our actions are simply highlighting more vibrantly what's happening, and they can push forward a little bit these processes that accelerate as compared to how they were unfolding before. But on the whole, these processes are inexorable and inevitable, and they would have happened regardless of how Russia could have acted in Ukraine. But what about our country? Something new over the last year? As far as Russia goes, yes, there are some issues. I referred to losses incurred due to the special military operation, and I always say that, yes, there are economic losses, but there are also enormous acquisitions. What is happening, indubitably, in the end, I emphasize that, in the end, will benefit Russia and its future. Why is that? Because it'll help reinforce our sovereignty in all domains, and in particular in the economic field. Just some time ago, with anxiety, we were thinking that we were turning into some kind of a semi-colony because we could not do anything without our Western partners. We could not conduct financial transactions. We did not have the technology. We thought we would be devoid of the markets or sources of new technology. We didn't have anything. They could simply, flick their finger and everything in Russia would collapse. But it didn't. And the fundamentals of our economy turned out to be far stronger than anticipated by others, even by ourselves. And this purification, this better understanding of our capabilities, this adaptability and the current conditions, as well as the objective need, not just to accelerate import substitution, but also to replace those who are leaving our markets. All of this has demonstrated that our businesses are capable of taking the place of those who are leaving. Those companies are whispering to us, we're not leaving for good, we will soon get back, but they're still selling billions in assets at $1. They are doing that, they're selling it to the management. So there is an agreement. They intend to get back. Well, how else? Certainly it's not a gift to these individuals. We understand the sentiment, we know it. And this is of great importance. We have come to realize in the end, we've always been saying that we are a great country, but now we understand that we can do it. We understand the consequences, the bad consequences in the midterm, because they are, shutting down access to technology for us, but that is what they were doing before. Of course, right now the situation is more difficult, but it turns out that we can do it. Another important component, a spiritual one, probably the most important one. First, this motto, we are not leaving anyone. And this is a motto which has been embedded deep in the hearts of each and every Russian and other citizens of Russia. The willingness to fight for our people leads to greater unity in society, and this has always been our country's strong suit. We've confirmed it and reinforced it. And during the last year, has there been anything in our country that has turned out to be true disappointment for you? Well, no. So no conclusion should be made, no changes. Well, these conclusions, we need them all the time, organizational conclusions, especially human personnel, human resources. We have to think about training new specialists, new workers. We need to find new people who are capable of working at a better level than the previous generation. But I cannot say that there is anyone who turned out to be disappointing to me that I have to, let someone go. Very good. Thank you. Mr. President, in February, you took the decision to launch a special military operation. It came as a surprise to all, especially to the majority of Russian citizens. On many occasions, you've given an explanation of the rationale as well as the causes, but still, this is a decision of such magnitude which cannot be taken without a special impetus, a special nudge. What did happen before this decision was taken? I said that on multiple occasions. I do not think I am going to say anything new, especially in this room, in this audience. I'm not going once again to talk about the NATO expansion, which was absolutely unacceptable. Everyone knew that. Simply ignoring outright our interests in the field of security. And in the end of last year, yet another attempt we made with our proposals. It was cast aside. They said, just, I'm not gonna say the words. But it was ignored, our proposal. With the support of their Western patrons, Kyiv authorities publicly refused to abide by the Minsk agreements. The leader said that they didn't like one point of the Minsk agreements. He said that publicly. Other high officials said that they were not going to stick to the Minsk agreements. The previous president said that he did sign the Minsk agreements, but he assumed that they would never be implemented. What else is there to say? If you need to embed something into the consciousness of millions with internet, with the media, this is one thing. And another thing is real politics, because there are some things that are happening and that are not being seen by people. And finally, real things came to light, became public. And we had to decide what to do with Donbass, because people were living for 8 years under fire, and they're still living under fire. We had to make a decision nonetheless, recognize their independence. But simply recognizing their independence and leaving them to their own devices, that was unacceptable. That is why we took the next logical step to incorporate them into the Russian Federation, because they would not survive on their own. They expressed their will, we know their sentiment. And of course, the fire still continued to reign, and Kyiv authorities were prepared to conduct new military operations, because there had been previously to more military operations, and people were still living under the fire, and we had no other choice but to launch a military operation. Because, well, the other option was to simply wait for the Kiev authorities to begin a new military operation. That was the rationale behind our decision. Let's get back to 2014. Why did they need to execute this coup d'etat? Because Yanukovych all but renounced authority. He agreed to hold elections, and I do hope he's not going to take offense. He stood little chance of winning. So why did they need this violent, anti-constitutional coup d'etat? There is no response. Probably the response is to demonstrate who the master was, you know, to tell everyone to do as they are bidden. There is no other explanation I can think of. Once the coup d'etat was executed, people refused to accept that, and this is what triggered the string of tragic events. The West could have implemented the Minsk agreements. Well, they're telling me that if I had been in the shoes of the then Kiev authorities, I would have signed these agreements as well. But they did sign them. And the heads of those unrecognized People's Republics also put their signatures to the document. One of them was later assassinated. So all of these actions resulted in the current tragic events. That's it. Do you have this sentiment that society has, that the enemy has been underestimated? Well, you know what the thing is? We saw what had been happening. 8 years, they had been building fortifications in the Donbass, very strong fortifications. Secondly, we understood full well that this process would continue. And the further it went, the more dangerous it would have been for us, and the greater our losses would have been. And this is why we did it. And NATO was expanding its military presence in Ukraine, and these fortifications would have popped up not just along the line of contact. They would have popped up in different areas as well. And from the south, from the north, our troops are going around the Donbass, and if we had allowed it to run further, if they had a chance to acquire new weapons systems, then the situation for Russia would have been absolutely different from the point of view of running this special military operation. On multiple occasions, you said and you wrote in your article that we are one nation. Did you change your opinion? No, because it's a fact, a historical fact. In the 9th century, these territories saw the birth of Russian statehood, first in Novgorod, then in Kiev, and then they joined together. It was one nation that spoke one language, ancient Russian, Old Russian, and the changes in the language started to happen only in the 14th century, in the 15th century, due to the Polish influence, because the western parts of the Russian state ended up in a different country, and hence the changes in the language. During the development of an ethnic group, different things happen. If one part of an ethnic group achieves a level when they think of themselves as a separate nation, you have to treat that with respect. But this principle, but this process happened due to a number of reasons. Some territories of Russia ended up in other countries, and these countries were pursuing their own interests. in Poland, these Russian territories were being Polonized, and heavy influence was exercised on the Russian language. You can look up the documents in the archive, and you can see letters to Warsaw, to Moscow, saying we are Russian Orthodox people, are asking Moscow, and so on and so forth. They asked Moscow to take them in the country, and they asked Poland to respect their tradition and their customs. And that is what they wrote. They wrote, we are Russian Orthodox people. Yes, afterwards, different processes started to happen. Then an enormous Russian Empire was born. European countries tried to set up, and they did, a certain barrier around the Russian Empire. You know, this principle that goes back to the classical antiquity, divide and conquer. And that is when these attempts started to happen, to divide and conquer the Russian nation. This happened in the 19th century, and then it was growing in magnitude, and it was supported by the West. And some people liked that. They liked that their language was unique, their customs were unique. This is the result of this divide and conquer policy. There's nothing surprising in that. Yes, they did achieve their goals, certain goals, and then it led to collaboration with Hitler during the Second World War, when Ukrainian collaborationists were used in actions aimed at eliminating Russians, Poles, Belarusians. It is a historical fact, well known. The most violent, terrible affairs were given to Bandera followers. This is part of our history. But basically, Russians and Ukrainians are one nation. This is historical fact. So it's a civil war to a certain extent. Yes, to a certain extent, we ended up in different countries, regrettably, due to a number of reasons.
First and foremost, because when the Soviet Union was created after the breakdown of the Russian Empire, and I wrote it multiple times in my articles, the Bolshevik leadership made the decision to pacify the nationalist sentiment who were originally from the Ukraine, and to give them originally Russian territories without asking the population who were living in those territories. They gave the Black Sea region and Donbass over. First, Donbass was given to Russia. Then the delegation from the Ukraine came over. They came to speak to Vladimir Lenin. He invited the representatives from Donbass and said that we need to redecide. So they redecided, and they gave Donbass to Ukraine. In that sense, the Ukraine was in sort of an artificial state that came together. After the Second World War, and it's a historic fact, Stalin gave over a number of Hungarian, Polish, and Romanian territories to Ukraine, taking away their territories from the countries. The Polish people who did not take part in the Hitler coalition took over some of the East German territories. That is how the modern Ukraine came to life. What I'm thinking right now, and it just came to my mind, the only true guarantor of the Ukrainian statehood, sovereignty, and territorial integrity could have been only Russia, which has indeed created the modern Ukraine. Well, if we talk about guarantees, I remember we spoke about that in the spring. Then it went off the radar. I think it's a rhetorical question, considering that there are hostilities and many things happen there. But both you and the Russian officials have said multiple times that the special military operation is going according to the plan. So what is the plan? The society does not really comprehend the plan. You know, Initially, I said it on the day of the beginning of the special military operation. The main thing is to help Donbass. I have already said that. If we acted differently, we could not place our armed forces around Donbass from two sides then, if we acted differently. The second thing, Luhansk People's Republic is fully liberated. There are military action taking place around Donetsk Republic. When our troops came from the south and the north, and it became apparent that the people who live there on these traditionally, historically Russian territories see their common future with Russia, we couldn't help but respond. Therefore, the events took place, and we all saw that. And that was the logical follow-up to the situation that was happening at that point in time. The plan and the goal has been one, to help people who live in Donbass. That is what we proceed from. And specifically, what the General Staff is planning. Well, I do know what they have in mind, but I don't think that's the case when I need to go into details. Thank you. Dear friends, I have satisfied my initial curiosity by monopolizing President, and now everyone can ask the question or questions. Let's begin with Ivan Safranchuk. Ivan Safranchuk, MGIMO University. You said that ahead of us we have a very important decade in development of the world and our country. But I have an impression there is a certain door into that decade. So I have the question about this door. If you could speak up into the microphone, I cannot really hear you. Lately, there is a great increase in nuclear rhetoric. Ukraine went from irresponsible statements to practical preparation for nuclear provocation. And representatives in the US and in the United Kingdom are making statements where we hear certain overtones of the possibility of admissibility of using the nuclear weapon. Biden speaks about nuclear Armageddon, and we hear comments from the US that, well, it's not that scary. At the same time, the US are speeding up the modernized tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. So what's happening is that there is nuclear saber rattling, but they do not recognize the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you could explain, Mr. President, is indeed the world on the threshold of a possibility of the use of nuclear weapons? And what would Russia do in this case as a responsible nuclear world power? Well, look, when the nuclear weapons exist, there is always a danger of them being used. Second, the goal of today's fuss around the nuclear threats and the possible use of the nuclear weapons is rather primitive. I don't think I'll be very much mistaken when I say what the goal is. I've already mentioned the dictate of the Western countries and their attempt to apply pressure to all participants in the world arena, including the neutral or countries friendly to us, that all comes to a naught. They're looking for additional arguments to encourage and convince our friends or neutral states that they need to all together stand up to Russia. The provocations with the use of nuclear weapons build in tensions about the very notion of Russia using the nuclear weapons. Have been put to use to this end to have an impact on our allies and our friends and neutral states, and to tell them, look at who you're supporting. Russia is so scary. You shouldn't support it anymore. Don't cooperate with it. Don't buy anything from them. Don't sell anything to them. That is a very primitive goal. What's happening in reality? We've never said anything proactively about possible use of nuclear weapons by Russia. We have only hinted in response to those statements that the Western leaders have made. Madame Liz Truss, the ex-prime minister of the United Kingdom, she said it directly. In her conversation with a representative of the media, she said that the UK is a nuclear power, and the Prime Minister has in his mandate the possible use of nuclear weapons. Well, I'm not quoting her, and she said that she's prepared to do that. And no one responded in any way. Well, she just made a folly. She was a bit out of it. But can you say these things publicly? Well, even if she said it, someone should have corrected that. Washington, for example, could have said that they have nothing to do with that. They don't know anything about it. There shouldn't be any offense made, but just to distinguish themselves from that. And what we are to think, we think that this is a coherent position, that we have been blackmailed, and what should we do in response? Pretend that we haven't heard anything. A series of other statements were made on that matter. The leadership of the Kiev regime is constantly speaking about its strive to have a nuclear weapon. Now that's the first part of it. And now there are more discussions about what we're doing at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So what are we doing? They're saying that quite directly, but they're always hinting that we're shelling and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Are they out of their minds? Well, we're controlling this nuclear power plant. We have our troops based there. I've spoken to one of Western leaders. It's been several months since then. We're saying, what should we do? They're telling us to withdraw heavy weaponry from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We said, consider that done. There are no heavy weapons there. Well, get rid of other weapons as well. Well, it's nonsense. You're laughing. It seems laughable. But I'm basically giving their statements verbatim. I said that you asked for representatives of IAEA to be based there. We have agreed to that. They are there. They even refuse to live in a hotel. They're living right on the territory of the nuclear power plant. And they can see with their own eyes who is shelling and where the projectiles are coming from. But no one is saying that Ukrainian troops are shelling the nuclear power plant. No one. However, they're building tension and building hype, accusing Russia. That's nonsense. It seems it should be nonsense, but that's really happening. I've also said it publicly already. I think there are 3 or 4 high-voltage transmission lines that have been downed by the Kiev regime around the Kursk nuclear power plant. Unfortunately, FSB didn't catch them, but I hope they will in the future. The sabotage was done. Well, they've done it. We informed all our Western partners, but silence is what we received in response. They did not respond in any way. So they're striving to have some kind of a nuclear incident, to lay the blame at the Russian door, and to start the new spiral of fighting against Russia, sanctions against Russia, and so on. I don't see any other point other than that. That is what's happening. Now, a new idea. We have published the intelligence data for a reason about an incident with a dirty bomb being prepared. We know where it is done, more or less. There is still some nuclear fuel that has been repurposed. The technologies that the Ukraine has allow them to do that. They've loaded up to Tochka U missile, or they could blow up and say that Russia did that Russia has conducted a nuclear strike. But it doesn't make sense for us to do it, neither politically nor military. We cannot disregard such things. And now they say that IAEA wants to come over and to check the nuclear installations in the Ukraine. We are for it. It needs to be done as soon as possible. And the inspection should be as wide as possible, because we know that right now the Ukrainian authorities are trying to get rid of all the traces of their preparations. We know that. And now, as for, in the end, about use and non-use, and the only country in the world that has used nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state is the United States. They did it twice against Japan. What was the goal? There was no military purpose in that. It brought zero benefit militarily. It made no sense to use the weapon against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, against civilians, basically. Was there a threat to territorial integrity of the U.S. or their sovereignty? No, of course not. There was no point militarily to do that. The war machine of Japan was already broken down. They could not put up any resistance, basically. Why did they need to kill off Japan with a nuclear weapon? Japanese textbooks usually mention that the Allies have conducted a nuclear strike against Japan. So Japan is in such a grip that they cannot write the truth in their own textbooks. But they remember this tragedy every year. Still, well done. The Americans, well, we should follow suit. They're well done, you know. That's what's happening. So the U.S. is the only country in the world who has used nuclear weapons. And it was done by them because they believed it to be in their interests. As for Russia, we have our military doctrine. Let them read it. There are specific articles in the doctrine dedicated to the cases and how Russia believes it possible to use the weapons of mass destruction as nuclear weapons to protect its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and to ensure the safety of the Russian people. Tomorrow, we're celebrating 60 years since the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when they decided to pull back. Can you imagine yourself in the role of one of the leaders? Well, apparently Khrushchev. Not in any case, no. We'll not get to that. Well, I cannot imagine myself as Khrushchev. Not in any case. Well, as a leader who will have to solve this kind of issue, we're prepared to solve any kind of issue. We do not refuse to do that. December last year, we have proposed to the United States to continue our dialogue on strategic stability. No response since December last year. We've received silence. If they want to, we're prepared. But if they don't, it's okay. We're developing our own modern technologies and delivery systems, including hypersonic weapon systems. We're self-reliant. We don't need anything. It is clear that they will catch up with us on hypersonic and so on. It's apparent that it's a high-tech country. It's a matter of time. But they're yet to catch up with us, and we have everything. We're developing these technologies. If someone wants to build a dialogue with us on that, we're prepared. Rasuran Maharaj, please.
You have answered a direct point that I raised earlier, but if I could expand upon what I'd asked. Escalating and accelerating crises continue to further reveal the precarity, the precarious position we are in and what our system currently is driving us towards. So unequal exchange continues, as you pointed out. Inequitous distribution, especially of human capacity, capability, and competence, render future prospects of reconciliation and reform inside an unfair yet hegemonic system extremely bleak. Sanctions, fear of reprisals, have rendered monetary sovereignty meaningless, especially with the weaponization of the payment system. In our contemporary conjuncture, what could then constitute a more democratic and workable alternative to the current international system of payments and settlements?
This is one of the key questions. One of the key questions of today's development and the future, not only the financial system, but also of the global world order. I think you've hit the bullseye here. After the Second World War, the US has created a Bretton Woods system and has fortified it and enforced it in many dimensions. They've created international institutions under their control. In the sphere of finance, international trade. Now, these systems are failing. And a major mistake by the US was to use dollar as a weapon in the fight for their political interest. That undermines the trust to dollar and other reserve currencies. It undermines the trust drastically, and I know what I'm talking about here. Now everyone is doubting whether they should have international reserves in dollars. It's not that easy to step out of dollar system because they have created a powerful system that keeps all the reserves in their grip. It's very hard to de-dollarize, but everyone is thinking about the future. I've already said it, but it bears repeating. How we see the future of the international financial system. Well, it's a general message, but still, each country should have the opportunity for sovereign development, and it should be ensured, and we need to treat with respect the choice of every country. That's important, also in respect to international financial system. It should be independent, depoliticized, and naturally it should be based on the financial system of the leading countries of the world. If it will be created, and it's a very complex process, still it is possible, then the international institutions will work more efficiently as well.
They have to be either reformed or built anew, and these institutions will provide assistance to those countries that are in need of such help. And first and foremost, this new financial system should be built and created in such a way that it transfers knowledge and technology. And if we do that, if we bring all these components together, then the very economic model and the financial system will meet the interests of the majority, not just the interests of the so-called golden billion, which we have been speaking about. And as a precursor to this system, we could cite the need for expanding transactions and settlements denominated in national currencies. Given the fact that the US financial authorities are using dollar as a weapon, hampering transactions, not just in our case and our partners, but also in the case of other countries. Well, given that, this desire for independence will push forth transactions denominated in national currencies. I think in India, 53% of our transactions are done in national currencies, and 27% with some other countries, and we're also creating the same system for other countries. In China, we are carrying out transactions in rubles and renminbi, and the same goes for other counterparts. As far as our own financial system is concerned, I think the main avenue is to create a system that is depoliticized, that is based upon national monetary systems. And this should be built to create a supranational currency system that is going to secure transactions. This is possible. This is practicable. And now we are please introduce yourselves when you ask a introduce yourselves when you ask a question. Alec Iskandaran, please. Mr. President, I have come from Armenia. My question is about my country and my region. Recently, we have been hearing an increasingly vibrant discussion about a treaty prepared between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And these discussions highlight that there are two competing projects: the Russian project with Russia as an intermediary and the West project with the West. The situation is a risky one. And across the region, the situation is volatile, teeming with risks. What does Russia think in that regard? How is Russia going to respond to this situation? What does Russia plan to do in this context in future? Thank you. Thank you. I don't know whether this was said publicly before. Maybe it was said, but be that as it may, I'm going to say that. Even if it was not said publicly, I do not think this is a secret. For many years, we've been engaged in dialogue with the Armenian side. We were proposing that the Nagorno-Karabakh issue should be settled in the following manner. Armenia was in control of 7 areas of Azerbaijan, and Armenia said that they should be moving towards normalizing relations. There are 2 areas. Next to the corridor. These are big areas. At a certain stage, an agreement could be reached with Azerbaijan to transfer 5 areas because there's no sense in keeping them. They are desolate. People have left. They were basically chased away from these territories. There's no point in keeping them. And to have still connection with Nagorno-Karabakh, these 2 areas would have been sufficient. And we believe that this would be, just, it would be fair to get refugees back, and it would have been a good step towards normalizing the situation in the region as a whole. But the Armenian leadership chose their own path. As you know, this is what led to the current state of affairs. Now a question begs itself of how to resolve this issue and how to achieve a peace settlement. We believe, and this is our position, that there is a need for a peace treaty, and we support peaceful resolution, as well as the delimitation of the border and the settlement of all the other border issues. The question is which path to choose, but it is up to Armenia and to the Armenian people and leadership to decide. Whatever option they choose, should it lead to peace, we will support it. But we are not going to impose anything. Nor can we dictate our will to Armenia. We're not going to. If the Armenian people and the current Armenian leadership believe that a certain option is preferable, as far as I understand, it can be the Washington draft, which recognizes Azerbaijan's sovereignty of Nagorno-Karabakh. If Armenia deems that acceptable, well, let it be. We will support any choice the Armenian people makes. If Armenia, the Armenian leadership and the Armenian people believe that Nagorno-Karabakh has certain characteristics, unique ones, that have to be respected, and that this should make its way to the peace treaty, then this option is also on the table. But they need to secure agreement from Azerbaijan. These conditions, these terms have to be acceptable to the other side as well. This is a complex matter, but Armenia is our strategic partner and an ally of ours, and to a large extent we of course have respect for the interests of Azerbaijan, but we will support Armenia's choice. 2 years ago, at this very platform, you spoke very highly about President Erdogan. You said he was not wagging his tail and he was a true man. A lot has happened over the last 2 years. What about this assessment of yours? Is it still in effect? Yes, he is a strong, tough leader. He is guided by the interests of Turkey and the Turkish people and the Turkish economy. And to a large extent, this is what explains his position on energy-related issues, on the construction of Turk Stream. We proposed setting up a gas hub in Turkey for consumers in Europe. Turkey has given its assent, of course, also based on their own interests. There are interests in tourism, in construction, in agriculture. We have very many coinciding mutual interests that go in the same direction. And never does President Erdogan give anyone a chance to take advantage of him. But of course, engaging in dialogue with Russia, he also advocates Turkey's interests. Turkey as a whole and President Erdogan are tough negotiators. Many decisions take a lot to come to. They require long discussions, tough negotiations, but we still achieve what we set out to do. And in that sense, President Erdogan is a consistent and reliable partner. This is probably the most important characteristic. He is a reliable partner. Is he not trying to take advantage of you? Well, as I said, he is a tough negotiator. He